And we're live.
Hey,
We're live with Todd Lockwood. How's it going, Todd?
good. How you guys doing?
Good. Glad to be hanging out and glad to have you on the show. You are our third guest in this education series, and I think the series has kind of evolved as we've gone from trying to get a firm picture on education to just getting different professionals' opinions on their own experiences in the field. So it's exciting to be here talking to you.
Well, okay. I don't know if you want me to just jump right in. I'll just tell you that I don't remember a time when I wasn't drawing. I've been drawing since before I could remember. One of my earliest childhood memories is sitting in my dad's lap while he drew funny cartoon animals for me.
Oh, yeah. I can totally relate to that. My dad, when I was younger, we used to go out to restaurants and he'd flip the paper menu over and ask us, what's the head of the animal? What's the body of the animal? And he'd draw all these great, fantastic animals from all these different pieces. And I was amazed by that. And that made me want to draw from imagination like that.
Well, this is the first time you told me your dad had some artistic skill.
Oh, that was Bear talking.
Well, this is the first time you've told me, Bear, that your dad had some artistic skill.
Yeah, no, my dad was an engineer and he took a lot of drafting courses, and then he kind of used that to keep us entertained as children, which passed on to me a little bit of a drawing ability, I guess.
Well, interest is obviously the first step, and both my parents were artistic, so I guess it's in my blood a little bit too. But I drew all the time. The first thing I would do when I got home from school is I'd drop my books and get out some paper and start drawing something. I did a lot of my own comic books when I was a kid. Just typewriter paper, what we would now call printer paper, folded in two, and I would actually sew them down the middle.
Oh, wow.
Sewing machine, because it was better than staples. She showed me how. She didn't mind me ruining her needles. And I would start a comic book. I only ever finished 3 or 4, but I had dozens that I started, and some of them were, funny aliens and comical stuff, but some of them were really serious, and that was a really good way to learn how to turn three-dimensional things in space, was to draw them over and over again from different angles, sometimes out of my head, sometimes looking at like a model car or something like that. But that was very foundational. And
so how old were you when you had started doing that?
Oh, 3rd grade anyway, 5th grade for sure.
Man, you were being nudged into art before the rest of us even got into high algebra.
Well, I always had an affinity for it, so my parents encouraged it. I think they both were frustrated artists, honestly, and so they were living vicariously through me or something.
I like that, though. Not many people get to enjoy a creative environment at home.
Yeah, I was kind of stunned when I learned in art school how many artists were discouraged from art by their parents. Although my parents took their stab at discouraging me too. I wanted to have a comic strip or do comic books. And they told me, oh, you can't make a living doing comic art. There's no way to make a living doing that. And I believed them because I was a little kid, as if they knew anything about the comic industry.
Of course.
But that discouraged me from pursuing that until way too late in life. But I did set my goal as going to design and illustration school. I went to the Colorado Institute of Art. It was part of the Art Institute's franchise. It's now the Art Institute of Colorado. I guess they didn't like being the CIA for some reason.
You went to the art institutes?
Colorado Institute of Art.
And it became, wow.
Yeah, I learned my craft at the CIA.
That's incredible.
So when you jumped into, so you originally, when you jumped into your college life, you were thinking of going into design, and you did, right? But what was
Well,
your?
I figured that I should get a design and commercial illustration tack going to, air quotes, get on my feet, as if I knew exactly what that meant either. Although it did kind of work out that way. It's much easier to get work in advertising than it is in the creative fields like illustration for fantasy and science fiction, especially, because that's what every artist wants to do. So the competition's pretty fierce.
Right. Um, so going back to the Art Institute, what was the experience like then at that time for you? Or at least what was the focus of that curriculum, I guess?
Well, the school was pretty well set up. The first quarter, we had design and typography and life drawing. We had life drawing throughout. It was a 2-year course. We had life drawing from beginning to end. But, in the first quarter, some of the really important classes to me were the design class and the what was this class? Composition class. Oh, I wish I could remember any of these teachers' names now. Those two teachers, I learned a lot from those two. In the design class, we made extensive use of a book called Fundamentals of Design. Oh crap, I've referenced it, I think, on my website. Woo somebody. Oh, I don't know if that's still on my website. That was in some of the FAQ before.
No,
We need Alan to fix that.
I'll
see
get
if I
on.
can find it while I'm talking. Anyway, in that class, we just created compositions with cut paper using a circle cutter on a compass. You know what a compass is for drawing a circle. You can put a little blade in it and then it will cut a circle.
Right. Wow.
The idea was to build these tight little compositions demonstrating things like repetition or anomaly, all those ideas in composition that can help create movement or flow or balance. So that was one class, and then the composition class, we actually talked about how those principles apply to a piece of art. So those two classes were a really excellent foundation, and I learned a lot from them.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. It sounds like you had a lot of influence from those, even going forward.
Oh yeah, well, it's always useful. I mean, I had an instinct for this because I'd been drawing for so long and looking at paintings. But when you take what is purely instinct and translate it into language, you're changing it from one media to another, and you have to think of it differently. And then doing that with a design class, which was using shapes and was creating images I would never have created on my own, because I wanted monsters and spaceships and explosions and stuff. But this was just circles and crescents and squares. That's all it was. It was strictly design and layout.
During that time, what were you doing painting wise? Were you doing any personal painting, or had we not gotten there yet?
Oh, I had done a few minor things for myself. Don't know that any of that stuff's on my website. It's in my art book in transitions. There's a pencil drawing that I did of some adventurers in a catacomb meeting a titan or a giant of some sort that I drew before I started art school, or when I was in art school the first semester or so. I remember drawing that by the light of the fireplace at the family cabin. It was just Rita and I there. What was I doing drawing with just me and my brand new bride in the cabin? I don't know. But so, and that was because of the influence that D&D was having on me. D&D was a fairly new thing at the time. This was 1979, and I started playing D&D in early 77. And it kind of blew my mind. This was something totally new to me. I hadn't been a war gamer apart from seeing Risk, those sorts of box games that you can buy. But
Right, the big strategy game.
the big strategy games, which is actually how D&D started. What was the name of the game before it was D&D? It was Chainmail. And it was a strategy game that Gary Gygax thought, oh, we could do this. We could run wars, but I'm going to introduce magic. You know, if we have cannons, then why not have a wizard throwing fireballs or whatever? And that was sort of the genesis of Dungeons and Dragons. When I started playing, it was just a little white box with pamphlets in it that were basically 8.5 by 11 sheets folded in half and saddle stitched.
So we talked about where like you were going into art school and then now you're experiencing games like D&D and adventuring in gaming while you're in college, but afterward you went straight into advertising. I mean, were you just not aware that you could put two and two together at the time, or? Well,
first of all, in Denver, there was no opportunity for that sort of work. And we're talking, when I graduated in 1981, there was no internet. Fax machines were rudimentary and crude, so everything had to go through the mail.
Right.
And at that point, I was already married, and we bought a house shortly after in 1982. And then our first child, Aubrey, was born in 83. So, and I got a job straight out of art school, which I needed to do. I was working at a design shop in Denver called, at the time it was called the Art Department, and midway during my tenure there, it became De Oliveira Creative. Richard De Oliveira was the owner and my first boss. And I learned a lot from him too. But it was doing design and illustration, but it was advertising illustration. A lot of cute little comic styles and airbrushed hot dog people and, you know, dancing beer cans, funny stuff like that. It was creative and it was kind of fun. And I learned a lot of typography chops from Richard De Oliveira too. Something I always enjoyed was the typography part of design. It's one of the courses we had in art school. And I had a knack for that too, possibly because I'd spent my childhood paying attention to typography on comic books and advertisements. And if it was a visual art, I absorbed it. Movies, book covers, magazines, illustration, advertisement. I just absorbed it all. It was all grist for the mill. So I learned a lot from Richard De Oliveira too. But I had a job. I was there a year and a half. But I knew that what I really wanted to do was illustrate, so I left him to go freelance. And then I was doing freelance illustration. I picked up some agents in New York who gave me all the shit jobs that none of their other illustrators wanted to do. And I learned pretty quickly that advertising is a brutal career. Especially for an illustrator. I've said it many times. When you're an advertising illustrator, you are at the bottom of the hill, the shit rolls down. Because everybody expects the next guy in the pipeline to make up their lost time and their lost budget. And the last thing commissioned is the art and then probably the pay stub.
Right.
So I would get a call every Friday afternoon about 3 o'clock. Oh, we need this piece of art first thing Monday morning. I never had a weekend. There were times when we got together on a Saturday for our D&D game, and I had a pad of paper and some reference, and I was working while we played.
Huh.
Oh, wow.
So back to thinking about education, were you feeling like after you had gotten these positions and were getting these jobs that you never had a weekend on, were you feeling maybe disenchanted about going to art school in the first place? Or
Oh no, not about art school, just about advertising. There was a point when I sent some samples, mostly stuff I had drawn from my D&D group as visual aids, to TSR, and they wrote back and said, "We'd love to use you for some stuff. Here's our rates." And I looked at their rates, $200 at the time, if I remember right, or $275 for a full page, black and white, highly detailed illustration, you know, battle scenes and shit. I can't pay my bills doing this kind of work. And they said, "Well, we can't give you covers because we don't know you yet." So that was kind of a letdown, is that the creative industries, the industries I wanted to be in, didn't pay anything. They were cheap, cheap, cheap. And that's because they could get people willing to work cheap because it was the fun work. But I didn't have that option. I had 3 kids and a mortgage by that point. So I had to do work that would keep the bank account filled. So it was lots of beer cans. I worked in Denver, like I mentioned, and the big fish in that pond was Coors. They may have some other big fish by now, but it was Coors. And so my diet was Coors, Coors, Coors. I painted more Coors Light silver bullet cans flying through the air, covered with dewdrops, than anything else during that period. At one point, around 1984, I believe, the guy I had as a rep then got me a meeting at a hotel, in a hotel room, with this art director who was traveling around the country looking for artists for this new startup magazine called Satellite Orbit, which was sort of a reader's guide for people who owned satellite dishes and were essentially at the time stealing content from HBO and other, anyone who was using satellites to transmit their content. Now people could put this big old dish in their backyard, and they were like 6 feet across. It was not like the little things you see on houses now. But they wanted some covers, and so I did a sample for them, and they liked it. And I did a number of those for them. And they were kind of fun at the time because they just said, have fun. As long as it's got a satellite dish in it, paint whatever you like. So the first thing I did for them was a field of 4 or 5 satellite dish flowers. They were satellite dishes, but they were red. And there was a bee that was a satellite. Its wings were like the solar collectors. So here was this satellite bee attending these satellite dish flowers. And that was the first cover I did for them. And I did 4 or 5 others and sent them into the Communication Arts Illustration Annual, and they got in on a page, which was very exciting. But then after that, everybody on the planet who needed a satellite dish called me, and none of them were creative. There was stuff like, oh, we want a family sitting on a couch watching their TV, and in the background is a satellite dish. Ooh. I remember that one in particular because it was heinous, but I got it done, and it was all ready to package up and ship. And between the time I left it and went back to it, my daughter had scribbled all over it with crayon. And I had to redo it entirely from scratch, except for cutting the masks for the airbrush. Those were already cut, but that was horrible. That may be why she never pursued a career in art, because I was really angry. I've heard since that Donato saves a corner of or used to save a corner for some of his paintings for his kids to paint on, and then he would just incorporate it however. Huh. Well, why was I not that clever? Oh, because I was doing very tight, very clean, very simple airbrush paintings for people with satellite dishes and beer cans to sell. And that was my diet, satellite dishes and beer cans. I got tired of that pretty quickly and started plotting my escape. I sent samples. I worked up samples of book covers and sent them to my agents in New York, Bernstein and Andreoli. hoping that they could get me some book work. And I'll never forget it. Sam Bernstein called me up one day and wanting to talk about something. And I asked him, why did you send me back those samples that I sent you? Why did you send them back? And he said, you don't want to do that work, my boy. That's not where the money is. Yachts and golfers. That's where the money is. Yachts and golfers.
What?
I didn't want to paint yachts and golfers. I wanted to paint fantasy and science fiction.
So how did the escape come about?
Well, the escape came about when here's the genesis of it. There was one girl at that agency, her name was Francine, who got all the jobs that had rolled down the hill the shit rolls down. She was low girl on the totem pole of representatives at Bernstein Andrew Lee. And she was responsible for the Asimov's and Asimov's magazine and the companion Analog. And at the time, Chris Moore, British artist, still working, very, very talented, does a lot of science fiction, still does, but he had gotten some sort of eye infection that was keeping him from working. And a commission he had taken for Asimov magazine was late. And Francine asked me if I wanted to do a cover for Asimov's magazine. I said, let me think about that for a minute. Yes. And it was a pterodactyl and a riverboat for one of the short stories in the magazine. So I did that, and she was very happy with it, and gave me another commission, which was two people next to their Mars rover disguised as a boulder for some reason. I don't remember why. But she really liked how I handled the people from that story. And she started giving me more work. Well, it didn't pay well, but it was great fun. And it paid well enough that I could justify doing it. And I asked her one day, how can I get more work like this? And she said, well, did you ever consider hanging a show at a science fiction fantasy convention? I said, what's that? I had no idea that there was such a thing as a science fiction fantasy convention. They've been going on for decades, but it just had never crossed my radar. So I went to the World Science Fiction Fantasy Convention in Winnipeg that year, WorldCon, in '94 in Winnipeg, and met Michael Whalen, who was my hero, and a number of other artists. Interacting with the crowd. My buddy Doug went with me. Doug, who always had a bit of a weight problem, but when we got to this show, he looked downright svelte. I was a little shocked at the nature of the people that are willing to give up their 3-day weekends, holiday weekends, attending a science fiction fantasy convention. But I quickly learned that these people are smart and funny and engaged and interesting. They're just couch potatoes, that's all. And a great many of them are still great friends. But that was like a doorway opening to a whole nother world. Like this is where I belong. This is my family. These are my people. And from that convention, I got a commission for Realms of Fantasy magazine, which also did not pay well, but it would be published work. It would be portfolio building. And by this time, I understood how important that was. I looked past that when TSR had shown me such dismal rates. But I was willing to take those now for a single piece. I wasn't willing to do 10 interior full-page illustrations for $175 each, because I simply couldn't have afforded to do it. But I could bang out one of these full-color page-and-a-half illustrations for Realms of Fantasy. Realms of Fantasy, right. I always get it crossed off with... oh my God, the D&D world. Forgotten Realms. The Forgotten Realms and Realms of Fantasy. I always get them crisscrossed in my brain. Realms of Fantasy magazine, no longer in existence. Did a couple pieces for them, which were seen, and commissions started building. I met a guy named David Martin at the first Dragon Con I went to, and we hit it off. Great guy. And he introduced me to an art director at TSR. His name was Stephen. His name is still Stephen Dinelli, but he was home from Lake Geneva visiting his parents in Denver, and so he stopped by my house and he looked at some of my work, and we hung out for a little while. And shortly after that, Rob Ruppel and Dana Knudsen quit off the art staff at TSR, and so there were 2 openings. And Stephen Dinelli asked me if I wanted to put my name in the hat, and I said, yes, please. It turned out that at the time, TSR was in financial difficulty already and was not paying a lot of artists. So a lot of the people that they might have hired ahead of me didn't want anything to do with TSR because they weren't getting paid. So here was this strange, rare opportunity, and I leapt through it like a man leaps through a porthole on a sinking ship. And that window snapped shut behind me because I took the job and arrived in Lake Geneva late September of '96, about a week after Randy Post, who was hired after me. And mid-November, my family came out. We closed on a house in Woodstock, Illinois, sold our house in Colorado. We're committed to this new venture, and TSR went bankrupt and laid off 1/3 of their people. I thought I was going to be stranded in Illinois with no work and no lifeline, but I was one of the few that kept on, probably because I did have kids and a mortgage. Like, they let Alan Pollock go, young single guy just renting. I feel a little badly about some of that, but the strange thing about that time in my life was early '96, my appendix blew up and I really died. And it's strange because it almost marks this perfect line of demarcation between my old career and my new career, my old life and my new life. The only part of my new life that I took with me was my family. I left all my friends and relatives in Colorado. But that was the genesis. And then I just started working and learning. That was really the best school I ever attended, was working at TSR with Jeff Easley and that incredible pool of people.
So that experience and being a part of that community, you'd say, contributed to your own growth?
Absolutely. And having been a D&D player gave me a leg up on a lot of people that they might have hired. I was already invested in the game as a player.
Right. So you brought a different kind of interest and passion to it than just any illustrator would. You were already vested in the game itself.
Right. I could be wrong, but prior to me arriving there, I think the only person on staff who was a gamer was Paul Jakeways. Not one of the better known artists from TSR. He always kind of labored in the shadow of Keith Parkinson and Larry Elmore, Clyde Caldwell, and Jeff, of course, and then Brom came along. All those guys, with the exception of Jeff, were gone when I got there.
Huh.
Although I got to meet them and consider some of them friends now. Brom is out here in Washington, although I almost never see him except in other states.
That guy.
That guy, yeah. But that was that. And then we moved to Washington when Wizards of the Coast bought them, and then 3rd edition went into the pipeline. And Don Murin and I were adamant that D&D needed a style guide, because one thing that was clear from looking at all the 2nd edition art, and some of the 1st edition art too, was that they would hire the art out to people and they would get back what they got back. And so a dragon could be anything from a kind of a cool looking Keith Parkinson dragon to a really stupid crocodile with bat wings stuck on it. It was just all over the place.
Right.
So that's when Dawn really was the loudest about that, but I backed her up, and together we got them to agree that there should be a style guide. So Sam Wood and I sat down, and it was like being a kid again, drawing on the kitchen counter with my buddy up the street, Kurt Palm. We used to just draw. We would draw. He liked to draw, so we drew together. It was like being a kid again, drawing monsters and armor and dragons and stuff, and getting paid to do it. It was pinch me work.
So as
Looking
you start,
back, you know, from '94, my first convention, to getting the job at TSR was 2 years. It was only 2 years. What a whirlwind. So fucking much happened in those 2 years.
so quick.
It
As you started to
I'm
take
still,
foot,
still makes me shake my head. I'm sitting here shaking my head with disbelief. It's
but it happened, and the style guide came out, and I myself, Alan in college is who turned me on to your work, and I'm still not a fantasy artist, but I do constantly go back and look at you and Brahm and other great fantasy artists for inspiration and to learn from you guys. But that kind of leads into, as you, Todd, took foot in the fantasy world and started to grow, when did the shift come to teaching? Where did that interest come from?
Well, it came from two things. First of all, when I was at my first conventions before TSR, I met a lot of artists, and I asked all of them for advice. And I got really tired of hearing again and again and again, "Oh, you're doing fine. Just keep doing what you're doing." It's not what I needed. It's not what I wanted to hear. There were two guys, Kevin Murphy and, oh my God, Joe DeVito, who gave me honest critiques and told me what I needed to know. And I was so grateful that I swore to myself that if anybody asked me what they needed to do, if I had an answer for them, I would give them an honest answer. I would not tell them, just keep doing what you're doing. You'll be fine. And so being in the position that I was, having done third edition and the books come out and suddenly there's this fan base, I started getting emails from aspiring artists who wanted to show me their work. And I would give them the answer they needed. I would take my time and write them a long email and critique them point by point and encourage them. I also swore I would never tell anybody, you don't have what it takes, you can't make it. And I've been vindicated since then with that attitude. There's a kid in Croatia named Martin who I started mentoring over Facebook a long time ago, when Facebook was practically brand new, I think, or new to me. And he was one of those kids who really, he didn't seem to have the talent, but what he did have was tremendous ambition and an amazing work ethic. And he took everything I said to heart, and he worked really hard. And now he is producing some professional quality work. He just had to learn what his bad habits were and how to fix them. But he also had to learn that hierarchy of knowledge that I'd gotten from art school, and I just fed it to him a little at a time. But all these people who I responded to put me in that frame of mind in which you're taking something instinctual, like I talked about earlier, and trying to translate it through words to another person's mind. It's kind of strange when you think about it. You're taking a picture with all of its language and then putting it into words, which are also a language, in the form of written text, which is a third language, in order to bring the person on the other end of it around to seeing what you saw in the first image. It's kind of crazy that human beings do that.
Do you think that's why so many artists told you, "Oh, you're doing fine," because they didn't know how to put it into words, what maybe they saw?
That's entirely possible.
No, I think so. I've talked to a lot of artists that I think are it's easier for them to talk to fans of the work than it is to talk to other artists sometimes, because it just came easy to them and then they don't know how to bridge that gap. I think that's,
or maybe they just didn't want to be bothered. There was one TSR artist, I won't mention names, but he would wear a t-shirt to Gen Con that said, "No, I don't want to hear about your fucking character." So, yeah, not many artists are willing to take the extra time. So I was determined to do that. And over time, I built up a bunch of text clippings. Basically, I would save every answer to every artist because I found myself saying the same things over and over and over again about composition and drawing out of your head and using good reference and value relationships and stuff. And so when I would get the same stuff again that needed the same answers, I'd pull out a canned answer, change the parts that didn't apply and add on more where it was needed. And eventually it became a really solid, long letter of advice that most aspiring artists needed to hear. And repeating it over and over again, maybe I came to understand it a little better myself. When I started doing the Smart School, and even before then, doing paint overs for people at conventions or at LexCon, I discovered that you learn a lot from teaching. And maybe it's partly having to translate it into another language, but it's also being presented with instinctual problems that I didn't have. People with undeveloped instincts or damaged instincts, and having to solve problems that I never created for myself. And also seeing other people's solutions to problems I had, but had maybe found other ways to cover over or circumvent or whatever, or just a new way of approaching a solution to a problem.
Right.
Critiquing teaching is educational for the teacher too. That was the profound thing that surprised me about teaching.
It's like the critique itself becomes a little homework assignment for the teacher. You're right.
Yeah.
I've never considered it like that, solving these problems that you've never considered, but other people are putting forth, and maybe you're not solving them, but you're just putting forth the direction you think is right. I like that way of looking at it. It's all reciprocal.
Right. Well, always paying it forward. I believe that in all aspects of life. Like I give to charity. I had a kid until she grew up through the Child Fund Network, and that kind of thing. You got to pay it forward. Us sitting in America making art for a living, we are in the 1% of the world. We can bitch about the 1% of America who are scraping off all the wealth, and we should bitch about it, but we are in the 1% of the world, and we really ought to have an attitude in which we're all in this together and we all always pay it forward. At least that's my attitude. It's not every man for himself. We're all in this together. That's the way I see it. So, yeah, I couldn't not give an honest critique and live with myself. Not after the long journey it took for me to get where I wanted to go.
Right. So now we look back at you going to school in Colorado. Internet was not a thing yet. Not a thing, not at all like now. But now we have Smart School, we have YouTube, we have podcast. Has your opinion of art education changed as far as what people should be reaching out to early on to improve and to get all they can out of it?
Seems like
well,
in some ways it has. I'm not convinced anymore that traditional art schools, with some few exceptions, are the right way to go. Do not go to a college art curriculum, a college that also teaches engineering and math and has a sports department. And, you know, their art department is likely to be the tiniest budget at the school, and they've got some frustrated fine artist who's going to teach you that you shouldn't use reference, you should draw from your soul, blah, blah, blah. They're trying to turn out the next Jackson Pollock or Andy Warhol. They're not preparing people for a career in illustration where you have clients with specific needs.
I like that.
Jackson Pollock had clients with specific needs that he was trying to answer. They were trying to get him away from things that looked remotely representational and that were entirely about the movement of paint on a surface. They just wanted surface. They didn't want any imagery at all. And he found a really creative way to solve that problem. You know, kudos to him, but now he's done it. Nobody else can just dribble strings of paint on a board and call it fine art.
All right.
Yeah, I think that goes along with like people's inability to be well-rounded and well-versed enough to teach other people, to bridge that gap of image to words. Is I think you get a lot of people who maybe they did, whether it was modern art or more traditional, saw some success in their career and they're like, oh, okay, I'll get another income stream. I'll go teach people how to be artists. When in reality, they don't, know how to teach, I guess, pointed art. They don't know how to teach people the basics. They just know what they know, such as Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock might have been a terrible teacher.
It's possible. He was a drunk.
Oh. That's true.
Pardon me.
I think you make a great point there, and it definitely shows in your own history. That at the beginning you spoke about your composition course, and I took a design course in college as well, where composition was a huge idea that was pushed, and it wasn't pushed in any other course, but I learned more about art and how to create it a successful piece in that one course than I did my others. So I definitely see where people are missing some of the foundations.
Yeah, but even though you had that composition course, I bet it was nothing compared to kind of what Todd had gone through.
No, probably not, because it was a general design course, but I'm sure that specific focus was revolutionary.
Right. The design class we had was not the one I was talking about earlier. Was strictly raw design in the abstract sense, completely in the abstract sense, using only simple shapes, non-representational, entirely non-representational. Jackson Pollock would have been proud. But, later then we had design classes where we had to do layouts for ads and stuff. But that initial design class might have been Wang. Was it Wu? Was it Wang? Anyway, my book's kicking around here somewhere, but I led myself off on a tangent. What I was going to say.
So you were telling people not to go to just regular colleges. Where would you tell them to go?
Seek out a school that teaches all those fundamentals, especially if you want to do illustration. You want something like the Rhode Island School of Design or Ringling School of Art in Florida. I haven't revisited the Art Institute schools since then. I don't know if they're still teaching that same curriculum now. What have they? I'm pretty sure there's still 2-year courses, just associate's degrees, which, by the way, I did not get. They started conferring degrees the quarter after I graduated. So I have the equivalent of an associate's degree, but I don't have the piece of paper.
So you're degreeless.
I'm degreeless, but I've got a master's in the School of Hard Knocks, I guess.
That counts.
No, I remember when we had I may have said this. Yeah, I did say this last week. Yeah, when I called Donato, who was the only artist that I could call on the phone, I guess, whenever I was, I had just gotten my bachelor's and we were looking into grad school. And he was like, oh, I would never tell another artist to go to grad school. It's not worth it.
Well, that's what they told us at CIA, was that that piece of paper doesn't matter. Your portfolio is what matters. And of course, that's true.
But you can't tell that to
not having
parents.
that piece of paper. I never aspired to get a master's. I do regret not having any art history. There wasn't an art history class. I'm sure there's things that Donato learned that are useful to him that I didn't, because he went for longer. He also did a mentorship with a well-known illustrator or painter, which I never had the opportunity to do.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people can get as lucky as others.
As Donato did.
It's well, I mean, and you're talking about how kind of you said TSR, for instance, didn't give you good rates, but then in going through advertising, you stumbled into Asimov, which stumbled you into fantasy conventions. I mean, that's kind of luck in a way. A lot of people have to be at the right place.
I've had lots of luck. Yeah, I'd like to think that as far as TSR goes, I was the right guy in the right place at the right time. And subtract one of those three qualities and I wouldn't have had the job. I could have been a month too late, or never met David Martin, and so I never met the art director who asked me if I wanted to put my ring in my hat in the ring, or I might not have had any talent.
So taking away the unknowns of that luck, what would you say to a younger you as advice now? If you approached your older self at 18, what would you have told him? The questions you had.
That's a tough question to answer, because in some ways, I wish I had started earlier. In some ways, I wish I had found the courage sooner. And it really was a matter of finding the courage to do it, because I was so shy. I was happy to have agents finding work for me. And at the time, if you didn't have an agent, it meant you took your portfolio out on the street and you went door to door and talked to art directors and tried to get them interested in your work, because there was no internet. Bernstein Andreuli always had the first few pages in the American Showcase, which was a big, thick book of advertisements for illustrators that every publishing house and advertising agency, and especially the big ones on the East Coast, would get every year. And they'd look through it and they'd find somebody perfect for the job they had and give them a call, blah, blah, blah. That was the closest we came to having a network. The internet has changed so many things. But I was so fed up with agents that when I started pursuing the work for myself, because I needed to, going to conventions and contacting people on my own, it was because agents had never shown any interest in doing that. They didn't want this work. They don't want 30% of nothing. They want 30% of big advertising rates.
So
they did take 30% when they weren't taking 35.
So have you found yourself pushing artists to be more self-reliant?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. You have to overcome your shyness. It took me a long time to do it. And even still, I didn't get over an awful lot of it until the time came that I had to do slideshows and presentations or be on panels at conventions. But I was able to get past it because I was at least talking about my work, something I was familiar with and which they wanted to see. And it was dark and they were looking at a screen. So that made it easier, and little by little I got over my shyness. And my first World Fantasy in I think it was Baltimore, 95, Cerberus won an art show award for best black and white, and that was announced at the banquet, and I had to go up and accept my award and say something into a microphone. And I'm streaming sweat, and I'm probably beet red. I do not like being in front of crowds. I just kind of leaned into the mic and said, "Thanks." But that was it.
Coming out of this, something that I'm finding interesting is how business minded you are about commercial illustration, and is that something that's just come from experience, or how did that come about for you? Because that's something I don't think a lot of young illustrators focus on very much.
Well, I spent 14 years in advertising, and we did have a business class at CIA for 1 quarter. I don't know. I think if you want to talk to an artist about good business practice who has good business sense, Donato is the guy. He's done nothing wrong his whole career, it seems, but he's made every exact right choice. And it's just one more reason that if he wasn't such a likable person, I would hate him.
Something I'm going to grill him about. We're going to have him on, I think maybe this week. I don't know. We're going to pre-record with him later on. But something I'm going to grill him about is in his smart school class, which I monitored while I was taking yours, he had a whole day where he just showed bad art that he did at the beginning of his career and only talked about all his mistakes. You should get in on that.
Interesting. I don't think I kept my bad art.
When Bear was asking, how are you so business minded? I was going to jump in and say you've mentioned this several times. It probably came from the mortgage and kids. That's why you had to be business minded.
Well, it's certainly part of it. That's why I was stuck in advertising for 14 years, being business minded. Where's the next paycheck coming from? And how do I build on what I have and make it better?
So you could not have, you talk about striking out on your own at conventions. Do you think that would have even been possible out of college for you?
No. And that goes back to your question, what would I give 18-year-old me as advice? And it seems like my career happened in the order it needed to happen for me to achieve what I needed to. But that I had to have some really dumb luck along the way. Now, I did make my luck by working hard on my art and being as good as I could be and making samples for the people I wanted to hire me. And I learned a lot from painting crappy advertising. I learned that I did not like the airbrush, and so I started painting in acrylic, primarily, thinking that if it was good enough for Michael Whalen, it was good enough for me. And then when I discovered oil paints, I realized that was my medium, not acrylics. And that's when I started doing some of the best work in my career. But the things that I learned and the lessons I had to learn, not just artistic lessons, but like putting yourself out there and being responsible for my own success and not waiting for somebody else who has promised to give that to me, to do it for me. It's like any education you receive. You only get out of it as much as you put in. The teachers can put it in front of you, but if you don't pick it up and swallow it, then it won't nourish you.
So snowballing off of that, when you're standing in front of a crowd or at IMC or in Smart School, talking to your students for the first time, like what's going through your head about like what do you need to give to them for them to soak in?
Oh, I don't know, case by case basis. At IMC last year, I just did a slideshow, but I think the important thing that I wanted to convey to them that I kind of saved for the last, which was after all these years, decades of doing artwork for other people to make other people's products or novels or games sell, I didn't own anything, or I owned very little of it. And that was the thing that I wanted to impress upon them, especially after having written a book and finally having something that I own and putting something out there that's my own. Save some enthusiasm for yourself. Keep some time for yourself. Be sure that you have a goal in sight, however far away it might be, in which you've created something you own that feeds your passion and that you could continue to do happily for as long as you can possibly do it. And that might be the advice I'd give 18-year-old me is, as you go forward, you're going to have to do some work that is maybe unpleasant. It's going to pay the bills, but it won't be your favorite thing you ever did. You might even hate doing it because it's the 50th beer can you painted this year. But save some passion for yourself. I sort of did that accidentally through D&D. When I was done painting the satellite dishes and the cigar boxes and the lottery posters and all the shitty work that I did, I was working on my world. I was drawing up visual aids for my players and having creative ideas about story and plot. And, that stuff kept me fed. I kept that muse fed with scraps from the D&D DM's table.
I love it.
Finally let that muse out of her cage. She was hungry and she wanted to be heard.
That's good advice. Pay it forward and hold on to some big idea for yourself, some point of happiness for yourself.
Yeah.
I like it.
If you find yourself doing work that just is sucking the soul out of you, set it aside for a couple hours and work on Cerberus or Kali or any of those short stories that I wrote. Or, some work is just grueling. And if it's not feeding your soul artistically, then don't be afraid to set it aside for an hour and work on something that does. Keep that passion alive.
I remember asking you one time, I don't know if you remember the answer. I asked you if you, how do you know if you're doing work that you love and you're not just doing it to gain success? Do you remember what you said?
I don't specifically. If you remember, it must have been just really pithy and good.
You said,
you find yourself doing it at 5 a.m. and you didn't realize it had gotten that late. It might be that.
You said because you're not getting paid for it.
Oh, well,
and that was good.
If it's 5 a.m. and you've been working on it, nobody's going to pay you to do it. It's probably what you love.
Yeah. So that when you talk about your short stories, I know you were doing professional illustrations and writing the short stories for free.
Basically.
Yeah.
No, I wrote the novel for no money at all until I'd sold it. But the advance was not huge. It wasn't enough to let me take off the amount of time required to finish the book. I still had to steal time from clients to finish it. So in essence, I was still doing it for free.
Right. Well, I think we're closing in on an end here, Bear.
It was a lot. It was a lot of information. It was some really good advice, I think.
Do you have anything else you want to add about education as we end here, Todd?
Oh, let me think back and see if there's a question that I got off on a tangent and never really answered. Yeah, I think we hit all the important points that I would consider important. No. Go buy my book. There you go.
Buy the book.
It's called The Summer Dragon.
There you go.
Amazon and Barnes & Noble both put it on their short list for best science fiction fantasy of 2016. So
perfect.
It's got some street cred.
Everybody grab Todd's book. Todd, what's your website?
Buy it from the website. Get it signed.
Yep. ToddLockwood.com.
Perfect.
You can't miss it if you go there.
It's true. The book is on the front page now. Okay, well, that's it. Bear, do you want to send us out?
You got it down so perfect. I can't take it from you.
Okay, well, if you liked what you heard, if you want us to talk about something else, if you want to be on our show, you can find us at Hanging Out with Bear and Alan on Facebook.com. You can email us at hangingoutpodcast@gmail.com. I'm Alan Morris, alanmorrisart.com.
I'm Bear Isles, BearIslesArt.com.
And thanks, Todd, for joining us. We're going to have Donato on next week, I think. Yeah, so.
All right.
Okay.
It was fun.
Thanks for coming on, Todd. We appreciate it.
All right. We'll see you next week.
Bye.